I'll see if it works. Okay, then. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, Professor Marliere. Thank you very much. I would say first, on behalf of KCL Politics Society and the KCL French Society, of accepting our invite to answer some questions about the incoming French elections, presidential elections, and their consequences on the European Union. So before starting, if I may introduce yourself to the people that don't know you yet. So you are a UCL teacher in French politics and European politics, and your research work focuses on French political ideologies, sociology, and as well as the relationship and the position of France in the EU. And before starting, I will just kind of present how it will go. So you'll just answer Q&A questions, questions and answers on the elections and the European impact that those elections would have on the continent. But before starting going into it, I think it wouldn't be a good talk if we're not speaking about the current Ukraine crisis and its impact on the elections. Obviously, before and during the crisis, candidates have had different opinions of what attitude to have with Russia. And this will have inevitably an impact on the outcome of the election. So just to give some examples, we're obviously not exhaustive. Zemmour, before the event, wanted to cancel all sanctions against the EU, all the sanctions of the EU against Russia. Mélenchon, since the event, decided to take a non-aligned position of France, while another candidate, far-left candidate, Puto, declared that it was impossible to be neutral. Some have even shifted, like far-right candidate Marine Le Pen, who said that in 2017 her position on Ukraine was similar to Russia's, whereas now she has condemned this invasion. So obviously it will have an impact, but will this Ukrainian crisis will even be the biggest deciding factor of the election?
Right. Big question to start with. First of all, I'd like to thank you very much for your invitation, Augustin, and also my thanks are extended to the Politics Society. Actually, I'm a professor of French and European politics. That's the sort of exact title. To get back to your first question, yes, of course, the war, which started about 2 weeks ago, right in the middle of this French campaign, is having an impact. I think it would be very surprising if it were not the case. It is having an impact simply because, like in any countries in the world, I suppose, I mean, most news are focused on the war. You know, if you switch on your TV, if you go on the social media, read a newspaper, I mean, the main stories, the headlines are all at the moment on Ukraine. So just for that reason, if you are in the middle of a very important electoral campaign, the effect is that the sort of traditional themes of any political campaign, any electoral campaign are set aside. I'm not saying they're not under scrutiny or discussed. And I think that's really the task of notably opposition party, the parties opposing, the candidates opposing Macron, the incumbent president, to make sure that, yes, we ought to speak about Ukraine. This is a very, very important issue indeed, and that an issue which is directly or indirectly affecting the whole of Europe, if not the world. But it really creates a new situation. Of course, that wasn't expected. It creates a situation which is, that's the second point. Any incumbent president during a war situation will clearly somehow benefit from it. And when I'm saying benefiting is not, of course, in a kind of a cynical way. I suppose Macron would rather not have a war, but it benefits in a sense that it makes him even more central to all debates. He is the man, as president, who is in charge of international affairs, of any negotiations. And as we know, Macron has been very active on that front, together with Germany. You know, he's the man who's been before the war and he's continued to do that, in touch and talks to Putin. And that's the Americans are not doing that. He's one of them, and there are not many people who are still carry on discussions with Putin. So of course, that gives him an aura and a centrality to all debates, which is reflected in the polls. I think Macron made a big jump in the polls and gained points suddenly since the start of the war. So that's really for my first general remarks. And yes, the war has impacted on the campaign because this is a phenomenon you find in other countries, but probably it is very acute, very strong in the French context. If you look at the position of the main candidates, and you mentioned some of them on the left and on the right, there's a kind of Russophile feeling, I would say in general, which means that until the war, some of the candidates were still basically arguing that, first of all, there wouldn't be any war, Putin would never attack. I think on that, a lot of people thought the same. Secondly, what's more, some argue that's the case of the two far-right candidates, Zemmour, Le Pen, but also a radical left or populist left candidate, Mélenchon, thought that in this intricate situation, the main culprit were essentially the US and NATO. NATO with this sort of allegedly tactic of encircling Russia by sort of offering membership to Central Eastern European countries, notably Ukraine, had literally pushed Putin to invade Ukraine. So that was really a lot of things going on. And I think we don't have time to discuss in depth this, but I think that's a fascinating, in my view, thing to consider when it comes to French politics, is how strong the kind of broadly speaking, pro-Russian feelings are in France. And it's not simply a matter for the left or for the right. It really cuts across all political families. You find that in some part of the left. I think in some part of the left, to sum up, it's essentially a kind of anti-American reflex, a kind of inherited from the Cold War, when at the time when you had a sort of two blocs, one led by the US, the other by the USSR. And Americanophobia is still there, and anti-Americanism is still there, strong enough to explain that some candidates on the left have, first of all, considered that the main culprit of the tension, and then which led to the war, were the US and NATO. And of course, they've rectified since then their discourse. Now it is really two imperialist blocs. That's what you read on the left, not simply on the French left, but you find that in France, two imperialist blocs fighting, opposing each other, the West and the East. And on the right, it is more a sort of an approach of, I would say, typically because of course, Russia is no longer a communist state, certainly not. Politically neoliberal, run by an autocrat, Putin, who was using the services of oligarchs, immensely rich oligarchs. I mean, most of them, by the way, are based in Europe. And I think for the far right, the kind of fascination for the Russian regime and Putin in particular is that it is an illiberal regime. It's not liberal. And I suppose that's what attracts them to Putin. So it is a bit of a strange situation. So it is impacting, in a sense, it is really strengthening the hand of Macron, no doubt about that. But at the same time, will it become the number one theme in the debate? I don't think so. There was this week a debate on TV. Macron made his first appearance as a candidate. Not a proper debate, by the way. It was a succession of two journalists challenging, putting questions to each candidate successively. So candidates were not debating, which is more the sort of traditional French style debate. So it was different. And I think some time was devoted to the war, but of course there are other very big issues, socioeconomic issues to consider. So impact, yes, essentially to the benefit of Macron, but international affairs are never, whatever the country, the main issue in a campaign. So I suppose that now we are going to progressively go back to the sort of traditional exchanges on the socioeconomic programs of each candidate.
Thank you very much. And actually, you've just made the perfect transition talking about the fact that it's maybe not the biggest theme, especially on socioeconomic factors, because what we realize when working these questions and looking at the French political debate currently is maybe the absence of certain themes in the campaign, especially concerning environmental issues and ecology. A recent poll from Ipsos Institute quoted that 94% of French people see climate change as a capital issue for the next years incoming, while some NGOs, environmental NGOs, said that in the debate, environmental issues represented then less than 2% of the speaking time of candidates in the elections. To nuance this information, of course, we can talk about the energy and all the energy issues that have been spoken about. But is there like an explanation of why this such an important topic for the French population has not come to the front page of the elections?
Well, it is true that due to global warming and the sort of the multiple attacks on the environment that we've known over the past decades and even more, I think clearly now finally, it's 5 minutes to midnight, and I think the situation is getting very, very serious. So it seems quite logical that now any national election, I don't think it will be something French only, but I think any national election from now on, particularly in Europe, the environment and what is to do to protect it will feature very, very prominently. So that's the reason why we finally get it. The second reason is that now most parties, not all parties, but most parties are taking the issue very seriously. They have now kind of very substantial set of policies in order to address those questions. Mostly parties on the left, the Green Party and his candidate, Yannick Jadot, but also Mélenchon and Unbowed France, La France Insoumise, are typically candidates now who devote a lot of time discussing those issues. Macron, of course, has to do it. Of course, now it will depend on how convincing those policies and pledges are for the voters, but it is there. To be fair, there were sort of commentaries made by environmental activists, some of the media in France saying that in fact, despite the urgency, it was disappointing that until now those issues had not been taken into consideration more often, and that finally quite little airtime had been dedicated to it. So you see, it depends very much how you view that. I think there will be certainly, and I think if you look at the sort of the policy platforms of the main candidates, and I've notably mentioned two of them, yes, there is certainly, this is something new. If you look back, 20 years ago, there were, the environment would get a mention, probably a couple of lines in any programs. That's no longer the case. Now there are candidates who really have set up a set of policies really which to break away from the sort of productivist economies that that we have. This is just to point to some ironies that the war on Ukraine, and in particular, leads to considering our dependency on Russian oil and gas. It's less marked in the case of France for the gas dependency than, say, Germany, but still. And you see here that there is somehow some kind of tension between the alleged pledges made in favor of the environment by some candidates, notably on the left. I'll take the example of Mélenchon, for instance, who was a very green candidate in many respects, but who said that there shouldn't be, first of all, any substantial economic sanction. And if there are any economic sanction taken against Putin's regime, they shouldn't have the effect of harming the French, economically. So that's a bit of a paradox and contradiction, in my opinion, because, the big issue today is, of course, to cut that gas and oil dependency, because, of course, it's massive revenue for financial revenue for Putin, and that finances indirectly or directly is wars. So it is very, for any green candidate or any candidate with a green platform, I think it would be very interesting at this time to push forward very hard this agenda of how in the short or midterm can we become independent from Russian oil or gas. And I think you see here that some candidates who are a bit uneasy, because on the one hand, they have made some very strong pledges in support of the and defense of the environment. But on the other, they have their own geopolitical agenda, and Mélenchon being non-aligned and also being quite reluctant to condemn altogether Russia. He finds himself a bit in a bit of a difficult situation.
Okay, thank you very much for that very, very complete answer. And you just spoke actually about Mélenchon, which is so in the part of the left, and which is nowadays, according to the polls, the one who appears to be the best candidate for the left to be represented at the second round of elections. But for the ecology to be brought to the first page, the headlines of the elections, it seems you talked about the fact that the Green Party and all the green themes, environmental issues were brought up mainly by left parties. But what has been seen in the past years, and there's kind of a consensus on that, is that kind of a French political left splitted into many different small parties, and there has been a spread of the opinion. Just to take an example of a main left party of a past republic, so from a republic since 1958. The Parti Socialiste, or the Socialist Party, has always been at the second round of the elections, apart from 2002. And they were the party at the government from 2012 to 2017. And now the candidate is polling at only 4% in the polls. How can we explain that there has been such a split into the left and that all the left cannot gather itself into the same group? You even wrote yourself a book, I think that was in 2014, titled "The Left Must Not Die." So is it the case that today the left has died, actually?
Well, just a point about the left didn't qualify. The Socialist Party candidate didn't qualify in 2002. That's right. That was the first time we had a sort of the far right in the second round. But also in 2017, the previous election, socialist candidate Benoît Hamon didn't make it to the second round. So that it seems they're on course because they have a candidate, Paris Mayor Anne Hidalgo will not make it. I can always make safely this announcement now. She will not make it to the second round. You credit her with 4%. I've seen lately that she's even lower than that. So it's really absolutely abysmal predictions. So of course, we are dealing with opinion polls, and opinion polls, as you know, are a snapshot of the sort of voting intention at a given time. But that voting intention, of course, as we progress into the campaign, will evolve. So that's why when people say, well, the opinion polls didn't predict that. Well, most of the time opinion polls are correct. It's just that the voting intentions keep changing until voting day. So to get back to the socialists, yes, there are multiple candidates on the left. There are 6, 12 candidates are running this year, which is quite a big figure, but not unusual. It's not the first time that in the first round 12 or so candidates are running. 6 of them on the left. Again, it's fairly high figure, but not unusual. It happened before. What is new is that together with 2017, because that already happened 5 years ago, the left is extremely weak. All voting intentions at the moment for the 6 candidates of the left amount to no more than 27% of the share of the vote. Compare that to the 2 far-right candidates, Le Pen and Zemmour. Their voting intentions are beyond the 30% threshold. So two far-right candidates weigh more in electoral terms today, as we speak, than six left-wing candidates. And that includes the best placed of them, as you said, Jean-Luc Mélenchon. So it's not the multiplicity of candidacies which is, I think, new and the real problem, in my opinion, for the left, because people argue, well, the left is so fragmented, that's why it is losing. I think that multiplicity reflects that the left in France is very plural in terms of opinion, in terms of orientations. There are big differences in on Europe, on the environment, on the nuclear energy, on even socioeconomic issues. So that reflects that. And I think that in terms of democracy and in terms of, playing the democratic game, this is quite healthy. The problem, again, is different. It is that, as you said it, the dominant party on the left since, I would say, the early 1970s, with the rise of the new Socialist Party and later the election of François Mitterrand as president in 1981, that party, the Parti Socialiste, Socialist Party, had been the hegemonic party on the left, always often in power, and when not in power, being the main opposition to the right. Since 2017, after a 5-year term by a socialist president, François Hollande, it completely collapsed. And since then, it hasn't recovered. So I like to use the sort of neologism to say, well, it's the PASOKization of the PS, named after PASOK, the Social Democratic Greek Party, which, as you know, lost, it went from 40% of the share of the vote to 5-6% in the space of a few years. And I think that's exactly what happened, and never to recover. That's the thing. Socialist Party should be more healthy, should be stronger today, should have recovered, because it has been in position. It hasn't. You may argue that it did quite well at the municipal elections and also regional elections. That's true. But the reason for it was essentially that it has, on the ground, a lot of elected officials. It's a party which still can benefit from local, regional support because it has very well known and tested leaders and officials. So people decided on those two counts to re-elect some of them. So it hasn't really lost too much on the kind of local, regional level. The trouble is that nationally, it is no longer seen as a credible voice for the left. And when I say the left in a French, it's understood as the reformist left, if you like, the social democratic left. The point about social democracy is in disarray everywhere. It's something you could hear a few years ago is no longer true. Some countries have just elected social democratic governments, lately Germany, Spain, Portugal, Italy to some extent as well, and Scandinavia. There's a strong comeback of social democracy, a new type of it, but it is there. So there is something really specific to the French situation about something broke there, something which is very entrenched, durable. Political scientists do not like to predict the future, and even less read the future in a crystal ball. So I won't be doing that, but it is fair to say that the PASOK comparison may be a good one. In a sense, it will not recover. It will be a party which will be there 5 to 10%, with some mayors, regional councillors, a small group of MPs. It takes time for a party to totally disappear and die. So we haven't reached that terminal point yet. But as for the Socialist Party being, again, a dominant party, it seems hard to believe in that, to be fair. Multiple reasons for it, probably lack of credible candidate, or at least a candidate which can rally around her, the mass of left-wing voters. The Hollande presidency, clearly people who vote on the left in France haven't forgotten or forgiven what happened. That presidency was really criticized on the left as being far too, having shifted far too much on the right. The economic and societal policies implemented by government had nothing to do with what a reformist government on the left should be doing. So there's a lot again of resentment, if you like, still 5 years down the line against the socialists. So that explains why the socialists are not making a comeback. So in the void created, and that's quite unusual because look, Britain, the UK has, I wouldn't say a party which is assured of winning next time around, but a party which can form an opposition, and a real opposition, and challenge the government with a strong parliamentary group and with a kind of a network of activists and a web of elected people across the country. It's no longer the case in France. So you've got now essentially two forces on the left which are trying to replace the Socialist Party as the new dominant force. You've got the Green Party. Green Party did well. The Green Party was traditionally associated and close to the Socialists for a very long time as a junior partner, even in government. Now, the Socialists being in crisis, serious crisis, there is a chance for them to become the new major party. There are very few Green parties which have become the dominant party alone in Europe. That's the first point. So I think there's no difference for France. It is proving very hard for the Greens to be seen as, if you like, the new alternative force and a new hegemonic left-wing force in France. It has done very well on some occasions, like municipal elections. The Greens winning a number of very important cities, big cities. That was really a first. But if you look at this election, it seems that we are back to the old situation of the French voters are quite ready to give power to the Greens at the local, regional level, but seems more skeptical when it comes to national level. To have, for instance, a Green president of the Republic doesn't seem yet to be that, and Yannick Jadot, for multiplicity of reasons, is not doing too well in the polls, around 5-6%. So he will not make it to the second round. So there's a second and last option, really, to be the new voice of the left and replace socialists, is Jean-Luc Mélenchon. Mélenchon, as some of you may know, doesn't come from the far left. Well, he used to be in the far left as a young man in the early 70s.
He was at the Communist Party, if I remember well.
Not the Communist Party, the Trotskyist Party, the OCI, one of the three main Trotskyist parties. So he came from there, but didn't stay long, a couple of years. Well, he spent a lot of time in the Socialist Party. He was even a minister in the Jospin government in the early year 2000. So he comes from the mainstream, always on the left wing of the party. He left the Socialist Party over 10 years ago, launched a new movement. And more recently, his movement is, and I think that was theorized by him, so it is fair to call him a populist, because he said that left and right divide is over, and now it's the time of rallying around the people, whatever the background of the people, your philosophy, your ideology, everyone should rally around me and to challenge the government and to challenge Macron and his unfair policies. So where are we with Mélenchon? It is worth also saying that in 2017 he did very well, getting almost 20% of the share of the vote nationally in the actual election. So he came even close to qualifying to the second round. He was in fourth position, but the number of votes between him and Le Pen was not that great. The trouble with Mélenchon started then, I suppose, is he was in a pole position. He was a candidate who had received 20% of the share of the vote, a very good result. Probably what he should have done is to try to unite the different chapels, so to speak, of the left and say, well, we're going to work together. That's not what he did. Of course, he said, well, if you like me, join me. But I said it earlier, the left was always plural politically, ideologically. You don't say people join me and follow me. You try to make room for all the factions of the left and all the different philosophies on the left. That's not what he did. And I think he paid the price during those 5 years. Of course, he had a parliamentary group, 17 MPs, not enough to mount a challenge, an effective challenge to Macron, who had a majority in the House. And so he didn't really mount a challenge, as I say, during those 5 years. Macron could do whatever he wanted. What he's doing now is yet again trying to be successful where he had been unsuccessful last time. And his ambition is that he's sort of gambling on all the other candidates behind Macron, because there's probably one certainty, bar major. I think they're probably the upset of the century, Macron not qualifying in the second round. But it seems sure that there are 2 spots for the second round if no one gets a majority in the first round. 2 spots. That's the rule. You can't have more than 2 candidates in the second round. So 1 spot is already going to Macron. So all the other 11 candidates are fighting for the remaining spot. And Mélenchon's gamble is the following, is that he hopes that all the other candidates, and I think all the other candidates ahead of him for the time being, i.e. Le Pen, Zemmour, and for a long time Pécresse, although it appears that now Pécresse is behind him.
Which are all right candidates, of course.
Yes, all right or far right. He hopes that they will kind of neutralize each other, because, that Macron will keep, Macron's voting intention will keep growing. So taking probably votes from Pécresse, but also a little bit from the far right, possibly. So that at the very last minute, due to a kind of a tactical voting on the left, people who wouldn't vote for him will say, well, maybe if I vote for him, he will just make it to the second round, and I think we're talking in terms of threshold. How much would it take in terms of percentage of the vote to make it to the second round? For the time being, Le Pen is on 17-18%. I think if she were to lose suddenly sort of support in the polls, then tactical voting could be very strong. There could be a very strong dynamic in his favor, and which means people on the left who do not particularly like Mélenchon, who do not entirely share his policies, would be tempted to cast a vote for him on the grounds that, okay, they may not like Mélenchon may not be their cup of tea, but in the end, between the far right or him, we better settle for the lesser of an evil, which is Mélenchon. So this is where we are now, where we're talking about the left, a very weak left. I said it, not even 30% of the voting intention, less than the total of the far right. The voting intentions of Macron alone are largely superior to, they are superior to the total left. Macron at the moment is on 31%. But his hope is that is gambling on the confusion and the competition on the left, on the right and far right, to just scrap a kind of the place at the very last minute. Is it a plausible scenario? I would say at the moment, and caveat, we are talking now in mid-March, so there's still 3 weeks to go. Mark my words. It is unlikely. It is unlikely because the gap between him and Le Pen is quite a good one. But who knows? If there are 2 scenarios today in that election, let's talk about them now. The most likely scenario is a rerun of 2017, i.e. second round opposing Macron and Le Pen. The second and last scenario, in my view, I don't see any other one, would be this paradoxical scenario of Mélenchon just making it the last minute for the reason I've just explained, which would be paradoxical. It's not very likely, but it could happen. It would be paradoxical because the left have never been so weak in France than at this election. So that would be a very interesting situation then.
Okay, thank you very much for this very interesting development. And you spoke a bit about the far right. And I feel it won't be a complete talk about the elections if we don't talk about the rise of the far right in France, and especially with Eric Zemmour, who was a former polemist, if I could say, or journalist on French television and on French newspapers, who decided to be candidate for the elections and was even at some point during the campaign the second polling candidate behind Macron, who could, meaning that he could go at the second round. So while on one side we have this split of the left and the weakness, you said it, more the weakness of the left. On the other side, you have kind of these far right parties strengthening themselves, even though they have split it now between Marine Le Pen on one side and Eric Zemmour on the other side. And kind of in a parallel with that, we've seen also the Republican Party, which is the traditional right party, who was created by the General de Gaulle, kind of shifting to the right, including some notions, as Eric Zemmour talked about, such as the Great Replacement. And we also saw Emmanuel Macron having some policies that also shifted on the right, especially considering his energy policies and his social policies with, for example, retirement age. So how could we explain, well, on one side, there has been such a weakness of the left side, then on the other side, the right has kind of, even though there's a plurality of parties, there's just so much more voting intentions into those parties. And such as a thrive also, sorry, to the right.
Absolutely, I would agree with your assessment, your general assessment. I think the French politics as a whole has shifted to the right. There are talks about, does it reflect a society in general which has shifted to the right? I mean, voters, are they more right-wing now than they used to be? It's a hard question, and the commentators, political scientists are quite split on that. And it's, in a sense, you can on certain issues say fairly liberal or fairly left-wing and still end up with that situation where if you add up Macron's votes, which for a lot of people now, Macron is no longer center-left, center-right, or centrist, but clearly a kind of it's hard to label Macron, but I think certainly not a lot of people now will not accept that Macron is center-left for sure, or even centrist, which is always a sort of unlikely position in politics, to be absolutely centrist. You lean on the right, a little bit on the left, depending, but the center is always a very difficult position to occupy. So if you add up Macron, Pécresse, and the two far-right candidates, yes, you could very easily argue that French politics is really very much has shifted to the right. On that, there's no doubt. And I'll distinguish between the two far-right candidates, and then I'll deal with Macron and Pécresse, because I think they are, in my view, two different blocks. I will say, like I suppose most political scientists, at least in France, that Le Pen and Zemmour can be labeled far-right. I think the media in France are calling them both far-right. They might not like themselves to be called far-right. There's always a stigma attached to it, of course, but this is how they are labeled because of their views on, on a number of policies, the ideas. For Le Pen, it's also because clearly she has inherited a party from her father, and we know the story of the Front National, then Rassemblement National. It's a typical far-right party. It's probably the most successful far-right party in France in its history. Party founded in the early 1970s, and at the time there was absolutely no doubt it's a far-right party with, people nostalgics of French Algeria. The older ones at the time were even pro-Vichy regime officials. You had and also far right, if no neo-fascist groups. That's what Le Pen initially put together. Of course, the party has evolved over time, and what Marine Le Pen did essentially, she made sure that there would be a kind of, because it was never a clear-cut break, but a kind of break with that kind of embarrassing past of neo-fascist and absolutely, and the racism, and notably his father's obsessions and anti-Semitism. Jean-Marie Le Pen was always keen to make an anti-Semitic puns, and that's not what Marine Le Pen is doing. I don't have time to elaborate really on whether this is absolutely a far-right party, but I would think that it is for its policies, also its legacy, and so on and so forth, even if Marine Le Pen's intentions have always been, since she's been a leader, to de-demonize the party. They've coined a word in French, to de-demonize, because to be seen as a far-right party is to be demonized. So more mainstream voters on the right wouldn't easily vote for them. So that's why she calls it that. We are the national right. That's what Zemmour says as well. Well, Zemmour's views, I'm sorry, they're so extreme. Notably, you mentioned the red replacement. His obsession with Islam, his Islamophobia, and a number of other issues so extreme that he can't be placed anywhere else than the far right. And I think the media have absolutely no hesitation in placing him on the far right. This being said, the traditions and the streams of thought, but also the sociology of supporters behind the two candidates are different. And that's a very interesting point. Le Pen's party, that already started under Jean-Marie Le Pen, the father. Initially the party was interestingly supported by a kind of Zemmour's electorate, which was kind of middle class, bourgeois, petit bourgeois. The 16th arrondissement of Paris, which is a wealthy one, I remember, in the municipal election in the early 80s. This is where you would get the most support for Le Pen and his parties or candidates. This is over that. Now the party tends to attract a good chunk of the blue-collar working class electorates when they vote, because working class voters tend to largely abstain nowadays. But when they vote, it is fair to say it's neither Mélenchon nor the communists who get the most votes from working class. It is. So in that sense, it is a kind of far-right party with a kind of popular working class anchoring. That doesn't mean that there are no middle classes voting for the party. Of course there are, but you've got that. And that's quite original, in my view, quite in line, I would say, with the historic ambitions of fascism. Fascism has always wanted to be a popular movement, cutting across, all different classes and social divides. That's why fascism was always to say, well, we're neither the left nor the right, we're the nationalist, national party. So she is that kind of thing. She's managed to position herself in that, with always an attempt to be de-demonized. She wants to be seen as a respectable figure, so no more anti-Semitic jokes or puns, and she's quite careful also when dealing with the most sensitive issue of Islam. Hard to sort of point to some kind of Islamophobic statements. They're very rare. She's very careful on that. Zemmour, on the contrary, will get a kind of, is getting the support of, I would call it, a kind of radicalized middle class, who has been voting for the right or right-wing parties so far. So some of them come even, for instance, from the mainstream conservative party, Les Républicains. That explains why the party has lost so much ground over the past few years. It's a party which has seen some of its support going to the far right. And Zemmour on that is really fulfilling a kind of gap to the right of Les Républicains, because who is he? He's not, if you like, strictly speaking, his history is not linked to the far right as opposed to Le Pen. I explained that there's clearly a historic legacy between Marine Le Pen, a movement, a father's movement, and the historic far right or fascism in France. No doubt. Again, the party has evolved. It's no longer the same as 40 years ago, but there's a legacy. The legacy isn't there for Zemmour. Zemmour is like Trump in the US. He's a guy who, on his own, went to that election on his own with no party, just launched a party like Macron, so 5 years ago, out of the blue. Zemmour doesn't even come from the political world. He's a pundit, media pundit. I'm not even sure he's a journalist. He's essentially a media pundit. And he was known by the public as a media pundit until a few months ago. And that wasn't a foregone conclusion that he would become the Zemmour that the world now knows as a candidate, which is credited with more than 10% of the share of the vote. And at some point, as you said, he was even credited of 15, 16, and even he was placed in second position. I think now there's a slump for him.
Mainly with the Ukraine crisis.
Sorry?
Mainly with your Ukraine crisis. I was just about to complete what you...
I think it's deeper than that. Deeper than that. I'll probably come to it, explain why. In my opinion, he will not make it to the second round. I think the historic far right will prevail. And so he comes from that sort of new far right, so to speak, a far right which is largely obsessed with culture wars. Culture wars in France essentially are based on national identity, and national identity is defined in France largely through discussions on French-style secularism. It's called laïcité, and the so-called values of republic. That's really what. And Zemmour, as a pundit, for years has sort of so-called allegedly warned the French about the Great Replacement, which is absolutely no doubt kind of white supremacist theory. It was coined by the US by white supremacists. In France, there's a far-right writer, Renaud Camus, who wrote about it. The Great Replacement, those who don't know it, it's the idea that due to mass immigration, essentially coming from North Africa and other parts of Africa, the indigenous population, French indigenous population, so there's of course some kind of racial undertones to it, will get replaced, physically replaced at some point by this new population, because they will settle there, have children, and with all the scares about also the rise of Islam becoming at some point the number one religion in France, replacing Catholicism, the old-time religion, as a new religion. And I think there's lots of talks, even novels. Michel Houellebecq wrote a novel about that, with the sort of fiction of a president, a Muslim president being elected around our period. He wrote it a few years ago, and it was taking place around now. So there's a lot of things, and there are a lot of French people who are clearly alarmed and think about that and believe that there is indeed something going on along those lines of Great Replacement. By the way, I'm not a demographer. I'm not someone who studies populations, but that's a myth. There's no direct imminent threat of Great Replacement in France. So that's very important. But those talks about Great Replacement were so intense, have been so intense in the French media, which, by the way, haven't been very good at challenging Zemmour on that. He was really given really a free ride on that through notably friendly media such as CNews, for instance. He was really given a platform, a couple of times a week to really develop those ideas unchallenged. And then other media, it's not simply the friendly media seniors, to the point that, and it has to be said to show how bad things are, the main conservative candidate Valérie Pécresse has referred to the notion in a public rally a few weeks ago, saying, yes, there is something going on called a great replacement. If we don't pay attention, it will happen. So for sure, Zemmour is exactly that, radicalization of a kind of middle class obsessed with this sort of national identity and also race politics. There are too many Muslims, too many migrants, too many refugees. Yes, it's true. I agree. I go back to your point earlier about he handled very poorly the Ukraine crisis, saying initially in the first days of the war that France shouldn't welcome and host refugees, going completely against the tide. Didn't feel that the tide, people were very emotional, so there was a movement of sympathy. I don't know how long it will last, but there is a movement of sympathy in France, like in other countries in Europe. People didn't want to hear that. It sounded far too inhuman, too harsh, too cruel. And I think it's just the drop which sort of makes it that now the glass is full. And I think since he launched his campaign, Zemmour has made a lot of very controversial statements along those lines. And I think when it comes, the closer, the nearer you get to the election, people who could have been tempted because of their fears about immigration, about Islam, could have been tempted to cast their vote for Zemmour, are realizing, am I really going to vote for a guy whose programs and policies revolve almost entirely around that? Because if you try to go beyond the great replacement and Islam and so on, Zemmour doesn't have much to contribute. Okay, he's very poor on international relations, very poor on the economy. He's a sort of has adopted a kind of classic neoliberal platform, but that isn't enough. For that, you have Macron, you have Pécresse, you even have Le Pen to some extent. So that's why is now going down in the polls. I'm not turning to the other bloc. It's hard to say that Macron and Pécresse form the same bloc because one comes from initially, that's the other oddity about Macron. He was a member of the last socialist cabinet 5 years ago as Minister of the Economy. So he was, you could argue, close to the Socialist Party, at least his right wing. Now, where is he? I think most of his critics would say, well, he's clearly a center-right candidate. And Pécresse is a sort of traditional right. So they are different. I can accept that there are differences in terms of profiles, policies. But what is interesting is to look at the electoral dynamics. It seems that to explain why Pécresse, who went as high as 15% of voting intention, is now getting close to the 10%, so she's really, as we progress, going down, down and down, is that Macron is now able to appeal to part of her electorate, and appealing in particular to his more moderate, centrist electorate, pro-European as well, because Macron, some people might argue, he hasn't really kept any of his main electoral promises, bar one. He's still fighting for Europe and European integration, which, by the way, has become a fairly unpopular theme in French politics, to fight for Europe and European integration. The left has abandoned that, and the socialists are too weak now. Even the socialists, as being weak, they don't really promote Europe anymore. They used to promote Europe very strongly. As for the right and far right, of course, they're not going to do that. So Macron is really the pro-EU guy in this game. And I think he's able now to attract this type of electorate who are quite appalled at Pécresse shifting to the right. I mentioned the example of her referring to the great replacement theory, but also on a number of issues, she is really trying to challenge the far right on its own terms, instead of saying, well, probably a Chirac or de Gaulle would have acted differently by saying, well, Chirac was seen by, former French president, was seen by some as right-wing on a number of issues, but I think he was always clear about the far right. We will not, he would say, we will not compromise with the far right. We do not share their values. We do not share the races. We're not a racist party. And in that, Chirac, however right-wing he might have been on certain issues, would not depart from historic Gaullism, the sort and the kind of an attempt to include sort of broad segments of the French population, to be an interclassist party. This is lost now for the Républicains, and probably has been lost before Pécresse. I think since Sarkozy, in my view, it was lost. So to call now this movement neo-Gaullist, post-Gaullist, I would really ditch completely the Gaullist tag, because there's nothing Gaullist left in this party. I would say it's a sort of classic conservative party, that the type of conservative party that you find in Europe in several countries. You see, like here in the UK. That's what Les Républicains have become. But it seems that between Macron, who has shifted to the right, and the far right, which is becoming so threatening now, there's no space for that party to really flourish and become the. So the situation is not as bad as for the socialists, but I can also conclude that for Les Républicains, which used to be the kind of natural governing party for the right, its best days are over. Now, if you are a moderate center-right voter, the strong temptation is to vote Macron in the first round, because people will consider it a safer pair of hands than going with Pécresse, which has been shifting too much to the right.
Okay, thank you very much for that development, interestingly, on the evolutions of the right side of French political landscape. Also, we have to finish with this talk, we have to talk about Europe, obviously, and the consequences that those elections will have for Europe. And I'll just actually, I think, regroup all the questions that we had into one big one. The first one that I wanted to speak about was, what was the impact of Brexit on the role of France as a main player into the European Union? Obviously, before Brexit, we saw kind of three leaders into the EU, which were Germany, France, and the UK, also Italy and Spain to a certain extent, but were seen as less stronger economies. Nowadays, has France become the leader, or like the only leader of the European Union? Has Macron brought this feeling of being the leader of the European Union? And considering the other candidates at the elections, a lot of them want some restructuration and reform of the European Union. Zemmour wants, the far-right candidate, wants to be out of the treaties. Republicans agree that it has to be rebuilt. And even Macron's Minister of Economy is against the Lisbon Treaty and want a rebuild of the EU. So the 2 or 3 questions that I may ask is, since Brexit, has France had an improved role into the European Union? And how much can France have an impact on how the EU will be shaped afterwards? Maybe we can link this with the Ukraine crisis and France's will to militarize and have a military defense of the European Union.
Okay. Interestingly, I think Europe will not feature very strongly in this election. Or less than 5 years ago. I think there are several reasons again, and I think Ukraine war is one of them. It's a war, although you can always, link it to some considerations about the future of Europe and further extension to the east, notably Ukraine. This is a possibility, and anyway, Ukraine has just applied for membership. So that's a real issue. I don't think they will spend much time discussing that, because if it happens, it's not going to happen now. So clearly they're not talking about it. But I think the reason why few parties will talk about Europe is that there's a kind of embarrassment about discussing Europe. 5 years ago, it was a vote-winning topic. You could, in the case of Macron, defend, promote a very an active role of France into Europe, and say, well, I'll be the president who really supports the EU. Of course, the EU needs reforms and new policies, but I'm here to consolidate Europe, not to undermine it. And 5 years ago, the other candidates were very critical of the EU, to the point that, let's remember, Le Pen was promising, if elected, to leave the EU altogether. You know, kind of something similar
with a referendum, I think.
Yes,
Yeah.
Something very similar to what happened actually in the UK with Brexit. And the Mélenchon, who was there and was also a very strong contender in that election, was extremely critical. He didn't go as far as promising an exit, but he was really very close to it, absolutely close to it. Strong criticism of EMU, the euro, you name it, and of course the economic policies of the EU as a whole. Now they're keeping quiet. I think Le Pen no longer advocates leaving the EU, and I think the reason for that is Brexit. Brexit happened, and this is probably testament of how unsuccessful Brexit is to the eye of observers in Europe, that no one now would contemplate going along, a Frexit and propose a referendum. And the reason is that, yes, the French people, like I think a lot of European peoples, have been baffled by what happened. During the campaign leading to the referendum, you had, again, on the far right, and Mélenchon, again, Mélenchon always ambiguous on that, because he knows that in his electorate is split on this issue, although he knows that a good chunk of it was more and more EU skeptic. But they were really kind of supportive of Brexit, saying, well, this is the voice of the people, it has spoken, Brexit has to happen. And this is what happened, basically, Le Pen, Mélenchon, and others. What happened when, the EU is not serving the interests of the people. Basically, this is what you had in the immediate aftermath of Brexit. But of course, that was 5 or 6 years ago, and now we've had time to look back and see whether Brexit has been better for the British people in terms of regaining sovereignty, in terms of boosting the economy, in terms of movement, making our life easier, better. And the answer, I think it is fair to say, is no, absolutely not, and quite the contrary. So that's why Europe will not feature. And I think, in a sense, that will help Macron, because Macron, and I'm coming to him now, is Macron the leader, as you said, of the EU? I think he'd like to be the leader of the EU, probably. Is he in actual terms? It remains to be seen, because to be the leader as something, you need to be acknowledged as such. And I'm not sure he is. Of course, he is a major player in there. He is a major player. It is because he's a major player in there that he's been, for instance, in those informal negotiations with Putin and the Germans. Well, those were the Minsk agreements, but the two major European partners have been there. So he's been very active on that. And also, yes, he's been making speeches about reforming Europe. He's been certainly pursuing the traditional French agenda of sort of deepening integration politically, and also giving Europe more means, to be an economic power. And that's for sure traditional, since Jacques Delors, the traditional French agenda, and he's been true to it and faithful to that kind of thing. But the trouble with Macron is that he hasn't had next to him a strong or a willing German partner. I'm not saying that Angela Merkel, just departed the scene, was a weak leader. Certainly not. She was absolutely one of the most influential leaders of post-war Germany and in Europe as well. But when Macron arrived in power, Merkel's power were on the wane already, because she would not run again. It was known. And of course, she had other things to look after, and for her, the sort of promoting ambitious reforms were never on top of the agenda. That's why he was left alone. So you had a Macron going from one European capital to another, or taking the floor in European summits, proposing reforms, but a little bit isolated. That's why it never really materialized. And I think if you make an assessment of his achievements in Europe after 5 years, it's quite weak. There's not much has been achieved. To be fair, it is largely because there was no political will around that. The pandemic hasn't helped. The pandemic, we've been busy with that the past 2 years. But Macron, yes, Macron being the French president, as you would expect, has been very much the pole figure in Europe. There's no doubt about that.
But if I may, concerning the pandemic, there has been kind of an EU agreement on how much money must be spent from the Central Bank of Europe from all member states. I think, if I'm not doing a mistake, has Macron played a big role into those 400 billions that were given by the European Central Bank to member states, and in this agreement between all member states?
Of course, the voice of France, like the voice of Germany, or before the voice of the UK, are extremely important. They're not all, because if you have, the EU works by consensus. If you can't impose, particularly for the big macro political decisions, you can't impose anything on anyone. So you have to compromise all the time. But it's true that when you have a kind of coalition between the big guns to push forward an agenda, look at EMU. EMU was wanted by France and then Germany, and then it happened. It will happen. Yes, he was absolutely instrumental in that reform, but I think on the whole, there were, particularly in Central Eastern Europe, a few reluctant member states, but overall there was a kind of a sense that the momentum was going really in the direction of doing that when needed to do that. Just to add a point about France and Brexit, because I haven't really talked about it, I'll be very brief. I think France really sincerely deplored the UK leaving the EU, despite always being an awkward partner. The UK was always a partner whose political agenda or economic agenda was not always matching the French one. But once it was clear that it would happen, I think Macron was on that quite realistic. He made sure that it would happen without creating any harm or substantial harm to the EU. I think on that he was very instrumental, always the voice of making sure that the UK wouldn't leave the EU, and on top of it would get some kind of benefits for it, undue benefits for leaving. The idea that if you leave the club, you stop receiving the advantages associated to being part of the club. And at some point you had Boris Johnson who kind of expected that, and Macron was very strong on that. So that's probably one of the thing he did. He probably also deplores that France and the UK had very close ties in terms of defense. And of course, it is making it not impossible now to be partners, but probably more difficult. So yes, I think it's a bit of a contrasted achievements. He did things, but I think overall he could have been more influential, but he was present at a time when clearly Germany wasn't really proactive in terms of undertaking new major reforms. Problems with some Central Eastern European members, and finally, I repeat, the pandemic has been a very strange thing. For 2 years now, economies have been quite, although there's been cooperation between member states, it's been very much inward-looking in general.
Okay. Thank you very much for that development on the place of France and Macron, especially in the EU. And so finally, the two last questions, but we will try to be a bit brief in order to avoid wrapping up the time. First question, just on the legislative elections. So for those who don't know, in France, first you have a presidential elections, and a month after those presidential elections, you have the legislative ones. So MPs are elected locally. There are 577 of them in the same system as presidential elections. I mean by that, locally, there's one round, and then there's a second round to choose which MP is going to represent the locality. And after, depending on the color, like the political color of the assembly, they determine who will be the head of government, which will be the prime minister. And in your opinion, first, can it be possible that in 2022 there could be a cohabitation because of how much some parties have still been very powerful at a local stage? You've told about the Socialist Party, maybe in another way as well, the Republican Party, and while other are very powerful, the national one, like the French, the Rassemblement National, far-right party of Marine Le Pen, and La République En Marche. So could there be a cohabitation in that way?
Okay, I'll be very brief. First of all, because I think we've been talking already quite a long time.
Yes.
And I'm thinking here of any watchers, if they're still there after all this time and listening to what I'm saying now. So let's try to keep it short. And I've given quite lengthy answers. That's also the reasons. But the other reason is that it's really quite prospective. You know, it's a type, I was telling you earlier, political scientists do not like predicting the future. And although I can very briefly say the different type of scenarios, what could happen? It's a very interesting question, but again, one very hard to pinpoint now, because it will depend on who wins the election. If it's Macron, as expected, the depth and the scope of the victory, it will depend on that, because depending on the scope and the depth of victory, you could have further realignments, left and right. Left, more transfers from the Socialist Party figures, elected figures, and also Les Républicains. If they do that, of course, the task for Macron will be easier to go to that election, win it, as it did 5 years ago with a majority. So in a sense, you could argue that things would seem, if he wins handsomely that election in a month's time, it would be easier for him to repeat that, because last time around he didn't have a party. Now he's got one. He already secured a majority, so why not do it a second time? And if he's got more support, and if he wins that election emphatically, that should be a foregone conclusion. In theory, yes. In practice, it might be more complex, and more paradoxically, he might not get that majority, in which case he would have to compromise with other parties, because he's been in power for 5 years. And it seems to me that Macron is ahead at the moment, not so much because it's a sign of massive support and backing for his policies and satisfaction for what is achieved. There should be a little bit of that, certainly, but it's not that. When you look at, for instance, what voters said about, do you wish Macron to get re-elected? And you see that the electorate is very split. So there's also a kind of feeling and a need for change. But why then is he ahead if people are not so enthusiastic about Macron? I think it's by default, essentially, is that all the other options would seem worse, far worse than sort of backing the incumbent president. That's really why. As for cohabitation, it would be the second scenario, which is neither getting a majority nor having to compromise with, for instance, Les Républicains to form a government, or bits of socialists if they accept to jump on board. It would mean he wins the presidential election, but then a majority in a chamber is against him. So it would be either the left, highly unlikely, very unlikely, very highly unlikely that the left secures a majority at this election. So there's only, that majority could only come either from the far right, highly unlikely. So I think the most likely scenario by default essentially would be Macron winning that election, securing again a majority, and if not, then making an alliance with parties to his right, probably Les Républicains, and governing like this.
Okay, thank you very much for that development. I think we now came to the end of our talk. Do you have anything to add or like anything that you want to finish with?
No, I wouldn't have anything because, as I said, it's been a long interview. Very nice, good questions. Very happy. I was given time to elaborate on each of the questions, so I'm fine. Thank you very much.
Then that's great. On behalf of the Politics Society and the French Society, I would just add that maybe the only thing that all parties would agree with is that for everyone to have the possibility to vote, go voting. It's not only a right, it's a citizen duty. So if anyone can just go and vote. That's the only thing I would have to say. But now that the conference is ended, so thank you very much, Philippe Marliere, for taking a bit of your time to answer those questions. Very, very quality answers and developments. And I think I know if you agree, we can end the recording of this session.